On behalf of my colleague, Dr. Bob Weaber from Kansas State University, and I, we would like to welcome you to this module entitled Understanding EPDs. I'm Matt Spangler, and I'll be the presenter for this module. I'm a professor of animal genetics and extension beef genetics specialist at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I hold a PhD in animal breeding and genetics from the University of Georgia, and I've had the pleasure of intimately working with the genetic evaluations of over 20 different beef cattle breed organizations. As a general overview of this module, we'll cover definitions of EPD and contemporary groups. We'll also discuss the different sources of information that are included into EPD and how a crossbreed comparisons of EPD work. We'll also define economically relevant traits and those that may be indicator traits. And finally, we'll talk about the factors that impact the rate of genetic gain. So let's define EPDs. Expected, which in the case of EPDs is an expectation of the average or mean of the offspring or the future progeny of an individual. I already mentioned progeny, the offspring, and difference, which implies a comparison between animals. You can think of an EPD as a measure of the relative merit among individuals in terms of their genetic potential as parents, or just an estimate of the average effect of an animal as a parent for a given trait. Contemporary groups are foundational to EPDs and genetic evaluations. And a contemporary group consists of animals that are given the same opportunity or an equal opportunity to perform. Generally, they're of a similar age. And as we include contemporary group effects into our genetic evaluation, we often restrict those to individuals of the same sex at the time the phenotypic record was collected. So you can think about a contemporary group as individuals that were on the same herd, born in the same year, in the same season, and managed the same way. They identify fair competition. If we were to take a group of individuals and disproportionately feed some more than others, then all of a sudden, not all animals are treated the same, and some are given an unfair advantage. As a consequence, all those animals together would not be a well-formed contemporary group. They are formed from management information, how the animals are actually managed on the ranch, and they are the basis of all genetic comparisons. You can think of a phenotype, how much an animal actually weighs, an example, as coming about through the contemporary group effect plus their genetic potential. Or a simplistic way of thinking about it is their genetic potential is their phenotype, subtracting off the effect of contemporary group. Of course, this is an oversimplification, but I think illustrates the fact that what an animal looks like, how much they actually weigh, their actual performance comes about through not only genetic differences, but also environmental differences that we try to capture in contemporary groups. So what information is included in an EPD? Well, foundational to calculating EPDs is some form of kinship, and that could include pedigree information, information from parents, grandparents, and collateral relatives, half-siblings, perhaps even full siblings. An individual's own phenotypic record is very important as well, and more specifically, how they compared to their contemporaries. Once an individual becomes a parent, phenotypes from their progeny inform their EPD as well. And so do phenotypes from correlated traits. An example, birth weight, weaning weight, and yearling weight are all growth traits which are genetically correlated to each other. As a consequence, if an individual only has a birth weight record and does not yet have a yearling weight record, the birth weight record can still inform the EPD for yearling weight, albeit a lower accuracy EPD for yearling weight. EPDs, through contemporary grouping, attempt to remove environmental effects, and as a consequence, EPDs are tools that focus solely on the additive genetic differences between individuals as parents. And they can be used across herds and across time, but in general are breed specific. Our very earliest prediction of an EPD is what we call a pedigree estimate, which is nothing more than half of a sire EPD plus half of the dam EPD. A pedigree estimate is the earliest EPD that's available and is available as soon as the mating is made and before any other phenotypic information is available on the individual. Once an individual becomes a parent, as the bull in this slide is, information, or more specifically, phenotypic information from their offspring or progeny contribute to their EPD. In this pictorial example, this bull has 5 progeny, and you can think of these progeny having come from different contemporary groups, perhaps different herds and even across different years. The numerical values on the far right are a representation of how much more or less a particular calf weighed compared to the average of his contemporaries. An example, the calf on the very top weighed 30 pounds more than the average of his contemporaries, while the calf third from the top weighed 10 pounds less than the average of his contemporaries. On average, this particular sire produced calves that weighed 10 pounds more than the average of their contemporaries. So now, if you think back to the definition of EPD, we have an expectation, we have the average of how progeny perform compared to the progeny of other bulls. So we have an expectation of progeny difference. This is a very simple example, and in practice, EPDs are actually calculated through a sophisticated system of statistical equations that simultaneously incorporate pedigree information and phenotypic records on the individual themselves, as well as all of their relatives. I would point out that the offspring of one sire exhibit more than 3/4 the diversity of an entire population. As a consequence, we expect to see variation in the performance of offspring from the same sire, just as we do in this small example. We learn about parents from offspring, and so these offspring records contribute to the EPD of the parent, in this case the bull. As we said, that initial estimate based off of these 5 offspring may be 10 pounds, but because he only has 5 offspring, our confidence in his EPD is not as great as if he'd had hundreds of offspring. And so through the process of genetic evaluation, we may shrink, if you will, or regress his EPD towards the population mean. And that shrinkage is proportional to the accuracy or the confidence we have in this prediction. Unfortunately, the EPDs across different breed organizations are not always directly comparable to each other. But luckily, the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, located in Clay Center, Nebraska, publishes on an annual basis this set of additive crossbreed adjustment factors, which can be used to enable comparison of EPDs across breeds. You'll note that in this table, Angus are all 0. That's because this table is used to convert EPDs of different breeds to an Angus base in order to directly compare them. As I mentioned, this table is updated annually, and I have a link down here for the most recent crossbreed EPD adjustment factor table, and this is available at the Beef Improvement Federation website. It's important to highlight that this table contains adjustment factors to add to EPD to be able to compare them across breeds. This table should not be confused with something that allows us to determine the average merit differences between breeds. So let me use an example. Let's say that we wish to compare a Simmental bull to a Hereford bull. And these bulls have the traits of birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, and milk. Perhaps at first glance it would appear as though the Simmental bull and the Hereford bull are identical in terms of their genetic potential as a parent for the trait of milk. But if we recall, these EPDs are not directly comparable, and that we need to use the additive adjustments from the previous table, we'll actually see that they're dramatically different. So to use this, I would go to the previous table and find the adjustment factors for Simmental and add those to the Simmental bull's EPDs. I would then do the same thing for the Hereford bull, find the adjustment factors for Hereford and add them to the Hereford bull's EPDs. When I do so, I find out that where it appeared they were similar, there's actually stark differences in terms of their genetic potential for traits like weaning weight, yearling weight, and milk. It's also important to have some understanding of where a bull ranks with respect to others in the same population or same breed, and percentile rank tables allow us to do that. They locate a bull's EPD relative to other bulls in the breed. An example, an EPD at the upper 25th percentile means that 24 out of 100 bulls are better for that particular trait, whereas 75 out of 100 bulls are actually worse. Now, an important note here is that better and worse are subjective and conditioned on what your particular goals are. Percentile ranks are an easy way to evaluate, though, where a bull ranks in a particular breed. Is he about average, in which case he would be at the 50th percentile? It's important to use non-parent percentiles for yearling animals, or animals that have not yet become parents. And some breeds delineate percentile ranks for sires and dams, or for parent animals, and for non-parent animals. And you can think of this as a measure of extremeness. This provides an example of a percentile rank table for active sires. You'll see on the far left the top percentage going from 1% all the way to the 90th percentile, and at the very bottom there are averages, which would correspond to approximately the 50th percentile, for a variety of different traits related to production, those that are maternal in nature, and those that are related to carcass traits. So an example, in this particular breed, if a bull had a birth weight EPD of -1, he would be in the 10th percentile. You'll note that they're ordered such that a lower percentile rank, an example 1%, so numerically a lower value, is associated with what is generally perceived to be more desirable. So in the case of birth weight, a lower number, so negative numbers are at the top. For other growth traits like weaning weight and yearling weight, higher numbers are towards the top. Unfortunately, some still question whether or not EPDs work, and I can assure you that indeed they do. They have been proven to be much more effective at generating response to selection than selecting on phenotypes alone. In fact, they've been shown to be 7 to 9 times more effective. And they can be used to increase performance, decrease performance, or optimize performance. So they allow a way to provide directional change in any which way you choose. I would say it's important not to select for maximum genetic expression without regard to other factors. An example, nutritional conditions. Selecting to continue to increase post-weaning growth, an example, without having an adequate production environment or adequate nutritional conditions could lead to a case where the added genetic potential can't be expressed because the environment limits it. This is a table again from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, and as they go through the process of calculating the crossbreed EPD adjustment factors, they also estimate the regression coefficients of progeny performance, so offspring born at US mark, the regression of the average of offspring on sire EPD. And our expectation is for every 1 unit change in EPD, we see a 1 unit change in the mean or the average of the offspring. So as a consequence, the expectation of these regression coefficients is 1. And there is no doubt there is variation across these breeds, although I might note that some that deviate the furthest from 1 also are associated with larger degrees of error. They simply don't have as many offspring represented in this particular project. But if we look at the pooled values, which you can think about as a bit of a weighted average for birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, and milk, all of these values are very close to 1, suggesting that indeed these EPDs generate the response or the change that we expect them to. Using EPD as opposed to visual selection or selection based on how much an animal actually weighed, their raw phenotype, if you will, increases the accuracy of our selection decision, which allows us to make faster genetic progress. This is called the breeder's equation or the key equation, which looks at the delta breeding value or the change in genetic merit per unit of time. And that's related to the accuracy of the tool we use to select animals. The I is selection intensity. How much more superior were the parents compared to the average? The amount of genetic variation, or more specifically, the genetic standard deviation. And then in the denominator, this capital L is the generation interval, or the average age of the parents when the next generation is born. And so by increasing accuracy and using tools such as EPD, we can make faster genetic change. I now want to introduce the concept of economically relevant traits and what their role is. An economically relevant trait can be thought of as something that has a direct cost associated with it or is directly related to something that has an economic return. If it is directly related to a cost or directly related to a source of revenue, we call it an economically relevant trait. Traits that are correlated genetically to economically relevant traits, but themselves do not have a cost or source of income associated with them, are what we call indicator traits. So in example, I would pose the question, is birth weight or calving ease the ERT? Well, the trait that has a cost associated with it is calving ease. If there are issues with dystocia, that can create costs in terms of labor or perhaps even mortality. Birth weight is an indicator of calving ease, but birth weight itself does not have a source of cost or revenue associated with it. What about weaning weight or yearling weight? Which of those is the ERT? Well, for this case, it depends on what the producer's intended point of sale is. If they sell calves at weaning, then weaning weight is the ERT for them. If, however, they background calves after weaning for a period of time and sell them closer to 1 year of age, then yearling weight becomes the ERT. I'd point you to a reference from Golden and others, published in 2000, which describes the concept of economically relevant traits in detail. And here I have an adaptation from that paper, which lists potential economically relevant traits and associated indicators. So whatever the sale weight is, related again to our example of what is the point of sale, becomes an ERT. Things related to the probability of calving unassisted, or related to feed requirements for maintenance of the cow herd, or things related to post-weaning performance in the finishing phase, so the number of days it takes to reach a constant finish, are things that are economically relevant. Other things become indicator traits. In summary, expected progeny differences enable selection on heritable differences in performance. Realize that an individual's own phenotype comes about through not only genetics, but also environment. And so as we select parents for the next generation, we want to make those selection decisions on the components that can be passed from one generation to the next, and EPDs allow us to do that. In some cases, to compare EPDs across breeds, the crossbreed EPD adjustment factors are needed. Knowledge of breed averages and percentile ranks enable us to gauge and determine the extremeness of an individual. How do they compare in general to others for a particular trait within the same breed? There's no doubt that many EPD exist, and depending on the breed organization, it could be upwards of 20. Some are for economically relevant traits, while others are for indicator traits. And it's important to know the difference as it pertains to your own breeding goals. For continued learning, I would encourage you to watch the next module entitled U.S. Genetic Evaluation Systems. For other related concepts to EPDs, I'd also encourage you to watch the Module 4 for detail about trait definitions, Module 5, which discusses multiple trait selection when you wish to improve multiple traits at the same time, and then Module 9, which discusses genomically enhanced expected progeny differences. And for more information about the USLGE, I would encourage you to visit their website. Thank you for watching this module.